Welcome to the In Betwixt and In Between. This is Leadership Limbo, a podcast aimed at helping leaders embrace the discomfort and power of leading themselves and others in the midst of it all. We blend real insight with practical tools to help you lead with self-awareness, purpose, and influence wherever you are on your leadership journey. There he is after his travels from Oklahoma to even the more central heartland of the United States. Josh Hugo, how are you this week, my friend?
Good. Boomer sooner, boomer sooner. Yeah.
What's better, that fight song or Texas Fight repeated over and over again? That's the question.
I personally like the Oklahoma one. I just think it's kind of catchy. Yeah, I was out in OKC. It was a good
tell us
trip.
about it. Tell us about your trip there.
Yeah, was with Giant Worldwide. So a lot of the consultants who I work with had a great chance to meet people in person for the first time, really. And really wonderful community, healthy leaders, people who really just care to help teams and people be their best. So I really enjoyed it. It was a good trip.
Yeah. It's a good town too, right? I was there once.
It is a cool town.
Notre Dame, Oklahoma game a while ago. Norman's not too far from Oklahoma City, if I recall.
You did? Okay. Yeah, I was, it's kind of a hip town. There's lots of coffee shops and restaurants. There's even a number of vegan options. I was very surprised by that.
Yeah. Well, it sounded like an awesome week. I encourage people to talk to Josh about his work with Giant and a lot of what they have to offer. But I think we're thrilled again this week to kind of dive back in more detail, even on the importance of communication. Josh is going to kind of remind us about last week's episode, the kind of the assignment that we talked people through. I'm going to give people an opportunity to consider. So I'll turn to you.
I'm going to bring my teacher disappointment voice into this one, but I can tell that nobody did their homework this week. If you read the liner notes, you would have seen a free opportunity to take an assessment. And I know if you took it because I get emailed if you take it. So, but in all seriousness, I think it would be a really valuable tool to take a look at, as well as the link to John's correlated personality tool. And he can share a little bit more in today's episode because we're going to come back to that topic today. So last week, we kind of set the stage for thinking a lot about communication and what the importance of it is. How do we start to get insights into ourselves? And we realized I don't know if we realized, it's more of the intent, but after we finished last week, we said there's more to be said. There's more to be said about this. There's more to dive into. And we both kind of came to the conclusion that it would be helpful to revisit communication this week, but spend a little bit more time on getting to better understanding. How do we do it? What is the process? And then how do you hold yourself accountable to understanding the tendencies that might exist, the motives that might exist, and how do you hold yourself accountable to working on those with your team? So passing it back to you, John, I think there's some ways that we're going to kick off here with how we're going to do that.
Yeah. So I think the main focus of today really, again, last week we talked about communication, its importance, and why it's such a critical tool or a part of leadership. And we talked about, well, it's the most kind of obvious, transparent behavior that people see in us that gets to the heart of them interpreting like what our beliefs are about them, about the work we're doing. So beyond just that it tells people what to do, is that it's the most demonstrable behavior for folks to grasp onto what we as leaders are telling them, right? I mean, both telling them, but also how we're not only telling them through our words, but how we're understanding them, how we're listening, and what that means. We talked about the importance of you can have intentional communication that is authentic. Just because you're being thoughtful about how you deliver something or understand how you're delivering it to a particular audience doesn't mean there's a level of inauthenticity to that, right? And we certainly talked about that degree of when we're thinking about accidental communication, when we're not necessarily thinking about the way we're communicating, but also that intentional communication, we have to make sure that we are narrowing the gap between those and realizing that our informal communication can be just as impactful as our formal communication. So that really wraps a lot of it. We began to dig into kind of your awareness of yourself that leads to the way you're behaving. And today we're going to dive way deeper into that, right? Mm-hmm. And so we want to talk a little bit about today of like how we've come to an awareness about our communication styles, and how do we look at our communication of ourselves without judgment of ourselves or necessarily about others, but actually really get to the point of unpacking it so that we understand what are the motivations behind why I'm communicating the way I am. And once I understand that, can I adjust those communication styles as well, right? So I want to talk about motives a tiny bit here. As I talked about last week, I talked about a framework called blind spotting, where you have motives at the center of this framework. Motives, again, are pretty subconscious. they can really be, it may be hard to understand or even know why we have some of those motives. Okay. I often like to talk to people about the difference between a therapist might really dive deep, really for a long time with you on those motives and help you understand them and unpack them, like dive into some of your psychological history, do some of those work. It might even get into a bit of a trauma that you've experienced as a person. A coach like myself isn't equipped or necessarily trained to do that, but instead is equipped and trained to help you think about what those motives are and what are the behaviors that are the result of those. And can we begin to unpack and strategize around those behaviors, right? But understanding your motives can help you to more fully see your behaviors and change them. And today, I think we want to really begin to provide some archetypes for communication styles and unpack what are potentially some of the motivations behind those. Ultimately, not to name all of them, but to get folks that are listening to this to begin to maybe take a bit of assessment on the way that they communicate and ask, well, why am I communicating that way? So,
Right.
Josh, a lot
Yeah.
to unpack their thoughts on that. What else do you
No,
want
I
to do there?
I love the idea of motives, and I think an adjacent counterpart of that is tendencies. And I think the truth
Uh-huh.
between both tendencies and motives is they're not going anywhere. Those motives are going to continue to exist.
Yeah.
Those tendencies are going to continue to exist. They're part of your wiring. Like, yes, can you over time start to think about where do those come from? Can I start to get healthier? Absolutely. But as you become more aware of your motives and your tendencies, where you can start to jump in are the patterns that emerge from those, right? So you can catch the pattern that comes from that tendency in your communication, and that pattern leads to an action. And the action that you're doing is another place that you can change. You can say, I know my tendency right now. I'm under stress. I have this challenging conversation coming up later today. I know I tend to move into my X, Y, or Z state of mind. That's the tendency you're identifying. And you can
Yeah.
speak more to this too, John, but like the motive I might have today is just to come out of this unscathed and just not get myself so worked up. And my motive is just to try to keep the peace today as
Yeah.
opposed to bring peace to others. And so you know that about yourself, or when you know that about yourself, you know that you can act differently. It's not that you're changing the tendency. You could say, oh man, I wish I wasn't so worked up about today's meeting, but that's going to happen. But what you can start to do over time is change your actions. That changes the consequences of those conversations, and then it changes the reality that you're operating in. So as a result of that, those tendencies or motives show up less. So
Yeah.
it's a cycle that we kind of want to get through as we talk about this today, but it really does start with this knowing yourself to lead yourself part of communication.
That reminds me a little bit. I've been playing this in my head while you're talking, but one of my favorite lines from anything is in the TV show Mad Men. And Peggy works for Don Draper, kind of rises up to be one of his chief copy people. They're having this argument, right? And she notices, she says of him, they're talking about how he communicates and he like takes credit for her work, which isn't uncommon when you've got the head copywriter and you've got the kind of people under them doing that. And he goes like, what do you want from me? She's like, you never say thank you. And he goes, that's what the money's for. And so it reminds me of like, what are your tendencies and motivations? And for Don Draper, it's all about status. If I pay you, then that should be enough for you to give me credit and do what I tell you to do. For Peggy, it's a lot different. It's about, hey, I want the understanding that you know that what I'm doing is valuable and I want that communicated well. And so like, what is your motivation? For Don, it's not, or he doesn't think it should be for people to need credit or to get credit. It's just like, hey, I'm paying you and that's what the money's for. And
Right.
I don't know that any of us are as explicit with that or have the deep psychological troubles that Don Draper
Well,
does.
I think there's plenty.
Yeah, and well, there
I
are,
don't know
right?
anyone listening
Um,
to our podcast, but I
but
mean,
because of
maybe,
that,
yeah.
what are Don Draper's motivations? I mean, if you watch that show, there's a lot of motives that lie underneath from his like childhood experience and from his life
Mhm.
in the '60s. And so what are his tendencies that come out? Well, it's not showing gratitude. It's not being thankful. It's not respecting the people around him. And certainly people feel that. And so anyway, you can kind of see how that play there in that fictional world. But I'm sure if you ask yourself, there are times when my motivations are X, Y, and Z. And so I communicate in a way that is harmful or
Yeah.
not good. And then that creates, to your point, I think sometimes that creates tendencies or even habits that we begin to not even think about why we're communicating that way. And we just do it over and over again
Yeah.
because
Habits and patterns. Yeah.
yeah,
Same idea.
we're
Right.
not seeing the impact of it, right? So anything else, Josh, before we kind of get into a little bit of the meat of this here?
No, I think that's a
Yeah.
good segue. And you're going to share a little bit more
Yep.
here about kind of the impact and the archetypes
Yeah.
of communicators. So tell us more.
Yeah. And so we want to talk about I think the impact that your communication has when you aren't necessarily aware of it and you have the same tendencies over time, and what that can say to others or what that can tell others, or how ultimately that can lead to dysfunction on your team if you don't change it. Now, sometimes these communication styles aren't in and of themselves terrible or bad unless they're overused or you don't understand the blind spot or the gap that that's going to lead to, so that you have strategies to adjust for that, right? So Josh and I want to talk to you about, we're not given a whole range of these, but we want to talk about some communication problems that people can have. We're going to surmise, well, what could be the root cause of that possibly? And why do you need to be aware of that? And what strategies could you use to do that? So a little bit of a fun activity. Ultimately, at the end of it, what we'd like you to do is ask a little bit about your communication style and what is that saying to others and why might that be the way you're communicating? What might be the motivation or tendency behind that? So I'm going to start with the first one here. I want to talk about, you have a communication style, and let's say you're the leader of a team, where you tend to always think in really big ideas and generalize. You're very creative. Let's call you a visionary sort of person, right? You have this real need to always be thinking about the next thing, to tell your team of, hey, we're going to try this new things. We've got this new big project we're going after, and I need you all on board. Okay. Now, at the heart of that, that sounds really great. Big picture vision. We all want to be led by someone with big ideas and who's pushing for the next great innovation. What can be the challenge of that? Often people who communicate in this style also do a pretty bad job of communicating the details of it. What's it mean to be on the ground of that? What's it mean to actually execute that? So what are you left with? You're left with a team who's frustrated by just another new shiny object we're chasing, a new big idea that's unclear to us about why this is important or why it matters.
Right.
And further, how are we going to execute this on top of the other priorities that we've laid on top of that? Now, I'm saying that's a pretty negative side of this. It doesn't have to be that way. But when you have this communication style that's big picture, but never about let's get down to the details, your motivation is more about, it's related to being visionary, right? It's related to being that. And so if that's all you communicate and then you walk away from those meetings and you tell your team, let's go do it, they can be really frustrated on how to do that. So what do you need to do? Well, I think one, people who lead that way need to name for their team, I know this is the way I lead, I understand it, and I have to have a few trusted people on my team that can then work with me to make sure that we get to the details, we nail down what that means, and we make sure that it's not coming at the cost of other initiatives and things that we're doing. Or I would say that's probably often what folks in that position do. Or you have to yourself know when it's like, this is my visionary mindset. I've delivered that, and now I'm turning that off so I can get to work with this team on how to actually execute that. That could be if you have a smaller team or a newer team that needs you to help with that. But in that case, you have to be a person who can like code switch between the kind of nuts and bolts side of it and the big vision side of it. But if you know you're just very incapable of that, or your brain doesn't work that way, then you have to get the right people behind you to help you with that are excited to take your vision and put it in place and not frustrated by these new ideas that you're always coming up with.
Give your
One
team
architect there. Thought, Josh?
Yeah, give your team permission to ask you questions,
Oh, please.
especially if
Yep.
you're that creative voice, that sort of visionary. Oftentimes, what you're saying in your mind is much more clear to you than it is to the people who are listening. So you could even extend what you just said is, yes, have people who complement your tendencies, your strengths, your potential weaknesses when it comes to your voice, but also just give people permission to support that by saying, hey, I often will communicate something out that is not very clear to everyone. It's in my mind, it's clear, but it's going to take a few at bats to get it really clear to all of you. So please ask me 5 questions after I say this, and it can open up the opportunity for the team to feel part of supporting mutual communication on
Yeah.
the team.
Have the meeting before the meeting with your strong number 2 who knows this about you, who's going to help you distill that. Make sure your
That
things
helps
get
too.
themselves placed in an agenda with time, so you're disciplined on how you communicate it, versus in the midst of a meeting you just start spewing ideas. That's also frustrating with people when it seems to come out of nowhere, even if you've been percolating on it for a while.
Yeah.
Again, this is maybe me as a super type A person who's linear and maybe not as like big ideas as others, but for folks like me, that really helps when it seems like,
Yeah.
oh, I see where this is coming from versus that came out of nowhere. Do you agree with
Totally.
that? Yeah.
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 Yeah. And another archetype that can exist is like the hyper detail oriented perfectionist voice. And
Yep.
so the motives or the tendencies here could come from a number of places, but for a lot of leaders, they care deeply about success. They care deeply about their team's success, but without greater awareness, that sometimes shows up in maybe what's experienced as micromanagement,
Mhm.
asking a bunch of questions. So, all right, John, I've set you off on this project. I trust you, right? I trust you. Tell me more about it. Okay, what about this first part? Are you sure? The second part, like, did you really think through that?
Did you
Okay.
think about it this way? And then you label like 5
Or then,
bullets for
yeah,
them?
then you just jump into your own answer, like, and I know I've done that, right? There have been
Oh, yeah.
times in which, like, I either improperly delegated because the person maybe wasn't quite ready, or I just was too in the way of
Mhm.
trying to make sure it met the vision I had, but I hadn't fully communicated, or I just wasn't trusting myself to set somebody else up for success. And
Yep.
so I think this kind of archetype, the hyper detail oriented, sometimes perfectionist can come through in the form of lots of questions that can also come through in like the very quick decision to pull a delegation responsibility away.
Mhm.
Kind of what we were just saying, but a lot of the like when you're thinking about effective delegation with another person, this communication style might have a tendency to remove all of the authority and just end up giving a lot of responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And that leads to disempowering your team. It leads them to feeling like you told me to do this, and when I shared with you my vision for what this was, you ended up ripping it apart with 1,000 questions.
Yep.
And there's a balance, right? Like if I'm delegated something from my own supervisor, I do think that there's a healthy level of inquiry that should be expected. I want to make sure I'm not missing something. But on the flip side, if you're only saying that I've given you a responsibility and the authority on paper, and when it comes down to actually living it out, I don't actually think you have any authority. This communication tendency can really create a disempowered team. It ends up creating a leader who functionally is the source of all truth and is also the person who most information has to flow through. Because if over time you continually operate in this way, your team is not going to feel empowered to chase and innovate. They're going to just say, well, I need to go back to Josh to make sure he's okay with it.
That's
And
yes.
if you, yeah, spend time on a team, and if there's 10 different people and there's 8 different roles, and everyone says, well, let me ask this person first, this is maybe a red flashing button that says, I might be operating from this sort of perfectionistic, controlling, poor delegation sort of motive. And it's not the motive is not, I want to destroy my team's morale. It tends to be something much more internal to you
Yeah.
about, I'm afraid of letting go.
Well, and it's I think it's also deep down tied to what's my comfort with risk, right?
Right.
Risk,
Risk
let's say like
aversion.
other just take things on without oversight, like strong oversight from us or guidance. And if you're in that space and you have the courage to say to yourself, I have a discomfort with risk to a certain level, then you can get to the job of like unpacking that and understanding, well, like, well, what is a healthy amount of risk I'm willing to accept, and then I'm going to push myself on that's going to kind of be in my zone of proximal development, right, to a certain
Right.
degree.
Right.
So I think that's like spot on there. Yeah, that's pretty good. Um, Another one we're going to talk about, I'm sure we're all familiar with this, and we both, I think, have been guilty of this one, is the over talker or the talking over. Now, sometimes this can be a person who's just maybe the first one to answer. I'm certainly this person because you have a quick idea and you want to get it out there. You don't love the silence of something when something's being asked and nobody's responding. You can't sit in that discomfort very easily. And then certainly the talking over, we've been in meetings where someone jumps in right before we've finished, or maybe you can think of a time when you've done that. And so certainly if you're the person that talks a lot or talks over folks or kind of dominates a conversation, well, what could that be as a motive? I would argue there are a lot, but I think a key one I have this desire to prove my intellect. I'm a fast processor. One of the
Mhm.
things I talk about that it talks about in Blind Spotting, Marty's book, is you can have horsepower. I can maintain and contain and get a lot of information. And that's how we think about this. Or I have like a really good processing speed. So I come up with an idea super quick, and you want to get it out there and you want people to accept your idea. You want them to accept it quick, right? Now you might be smart, process quick. And a lot of times these are the folks that help keep things moving forward. They help us to like gather information, put it together. The problem is when you're the only one talking and you're not providing space for others, then it just becomes your voice that's heard. That becomes the first initial idea. Others who are maybe have the thought of like, well, that person's pretty smart, we're just going to go with that, aren't being challenged to think. They're maybe even afraid to think, right? And so if you've got this, then you have to ask yourself, am I doing this at some level to prove that I'm the smartest person in the room, or I have the best ideas? And that limits, even if I either intentionally limits other people's ideas and I'm not willing to listen to them, and that's going further down a motivation for power, or at worst just like, well, I'm just trying to produce ideas, but then what it leads to is others not willing to be able to do it. So then you might think, well, I need to create meetings where we structure the way who talks first each time.
Yeah, I
Or
was literally writing
yeah,
that
why don't you
down.
go
I'm
into
like,
some
we
ideas
should
for
do
that?
that.
Like, that's so we've got this thing where you may not even be aware of it, but you're actually trying to prove you're the smartest person in the room. right? So what other ideas do you have related to that, Josh? Or
No, that's
what
great. I mean,
resonates with you on that?
yeah, really well said. I think we used and we'll get to some tools in a few minutes too, but like voice equity, we used to have that role. You got to be careful with that word, I guess, these days. But the point being, like, is there a balance across all the different people talking
Yeah.
in this meeting? And at the end of it, and I'll talk about this later, but I think there's ways to kind of get at balancing out the volume of different voice tendencies on your team and knowing which voices need to, as the facilitator, be asked the question first and say, "Hey, John, hold on to that. I know
Mhm.
that you have something great to say, but we're going to go to Sarah or we're going to go to Steve first because we want to make sure we hear from them." Good facilitation in combination with good self-awareness can help with this one. But the motives, yeah, absolutely agree with those. I want to add to this also, and when we go back to last week, we talked about the formula, if you will, for
Yeah, right.
communication is communication equals transmission plus receiving. And so what we've talked about thus far is the big idea person, the hyper detail oriented person, the over talker. That's a lot about transmission. But as another critical part of thinking about communication tendencies is, how do you listen? How do you listen? Are you kind of getting ready for the next idea in your head? And we can all be guilty of that. Are you fully present? But when you think about the role of communication being both parts, another sort of archetype is the poor listener or the person who's jotting down notes or staring off into the future. Like, there's nothing faster to kind of ruin the vibe in a meeting when you've asked this other person a question. "Hey, John, how was your day?" And then as you're answering it, and again, guilty as charged
Yeah.
sometimes, you kind of look off into the horizon as they're answering it. It shows that you're not very interested. So I want to leave with this segment with this question. Are you seeking to be more interesting or more interested? And that posture in both forms of communication, transmission and receiving, I believe is such a fundamental question to be asked of yourself, is that if you're seeking to be interested, that includes both how you're transmitting your communication. Are you asking questions? Are you sharing the air? Are you referring back to what somebody said? And also how you're receiving it. If you're seeking to be interested, you're going to be actively listening. As opposed to being interesting, it's really about you saying what you need to say, pause, let somebody else say their part, and then you jump back in. It's the difference between like a Socratic dialogue that kind of goes back and forth between individuals or a ping pong match. It's kind of like it went from A to B, and then the next, like, how many of us have been part of conversations where it really feels like it's not actually building on the previous thing somebody said, but John shares something, I share something, John shares something new, I share something new. We've really just had a bunch of individual ideas that haven't been received. And so I think that it's really critical to think about, are you trying to be interesting or interested?
Yeah. I mean, both teachers, one of the a teaching strategy, Erin Waller Cleveland, she listens to our podcast sometimes and focuses more in math, but she shared the idea of, as a teacher, are you playing tennis or are you playing volleyball? Right. And I
I
think
like
what you
that.
said,
Yeah.
like, is it you say something, then I respond as the facilitator and leader? Or and I want to bring it back to us as middle managers, if you're leading a team, right? And I love this idea. If you are like, the most important thing for me is to be interesting for my team so they listen to me and know that I'm like the top person in the room and that I'm the one leading us. That's not going to be good over time
Right.
versus I want to show people that I'm interested in them and their ideas, and then my job is to coalesce that, bring it together where necessary, make decisions or make hard determinations of what we got to do, but help
Hmm.
them to know that I'm hearing them. That's your job, right? And part of that is we're playing volleyball. So someone says something, you're like, interesting idea. Does anybody want to respond to that? Right? Who else has a different idea? I want someone to play devil's advocate right now. Give us the problem of if we go or go in that direction. That's very different than like, no, I don't think so, and here's why. You're not
It's
building
back
that
and forth.
coalition. So yeah, I think a really awesome ideas.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into the part two here then, Josh. We've given some archetypes. There's many more. What's that mean for
Totally.
like some work we got to do to help ourselves to understand why we're communicating the way we are?
Yeah, and we'll hit this last part pretty quickly here because I know we try to keep our podcast
Yeah.
to about that 30-minute mark. We're not going to dive back into this in depth, but one of the ways that you can start to gain insights, John and I have personally gained insights over the years through personality assessments. And there is value in taking one of those. You can look at that and gather the information that feels relevant to you, but I would also challenge yourself to say, maybe some of this is relevant that I didn't think it maybe initially was. But these tools can be one source of getting that information about tendencies. And there's different ones out there. Again, there's the 5 voices, behavior essentials, DISC, blind spotting. What's the name of the assessment actually, John, that you do?
Well, blind spotting is one that I use, and then the E3 is the one through Behavioral Essentials. And I would also just know we're calling it personality assessment, and this is a longer conversation. I think behavior assessments are the way to go, personally. I mean, granted, even if you do a personality one, that's great, but make sure it's helping you to dig into the behaviors that are the result of those
That's right.
personalities. Just one thing to think about. But yeah, continue on.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And both of those. And I even just took DISC the other day, another interesting tool that gets a lot at like the tendencies, but the behaviors as well.
Yeah.
So we recommend taking one of those. There's a lot out there. We'll put them in the chat again, or not in the chat, in the podcast notes today. So feel free to take one of those. And then John, you had some other ideas about how to gain awareness about these tendencies. Because if you listen to this, you're like, shoot, I might be the person who overtalks, but I'm not really sure. Am I a poor listener? Some of it's self-reflection, but you have a few
Yeah.
other tools that you wanted to tell us about.
Yeah, I want to talk about this. I want to respond to one thing about what you just said, though. Taking the assessment is one thing, because I think a lot of us have taken a lot of them, whether it's team retreats or anything in the past. And they're great. They're great for discussion points when you're meeting with your team and like, oh, I'm this type of communicator, you're this, etc. What's more important is using that then to effectively think about like, what's my plan or my development plan for myself or in working with my
Applying it.
boss. So I'm just promoting that because I think as someone who's taken a lot of these over the years, they're only fruitful if then it like becomes a sticking point for how I think about myself and the way I lead others.
Yeah, thanks for saying that.
yeah.
I agree. And that's honestly both of our philosophies with how we do our consulting engagements is that we're not using tools that are just like inspirational in the moment. And it's like, oh, that was fun. And then you never remember what it is the next week. You have to be able to apply them. And that's something that John and I can both speak to anyone who's interested about how we do that.
Yeah. But to some other ideas, I mean, the number one thing you can do and is the easiest, well, it may not be the easiest because you got to have some pretty profound trust, but you have to show the vulnerability to go to a person or people on your team or that you, and frankly, this can be your partner. If you have old enough children, it can be your children that can help you with this and say, tell me about how I communicate, both that's positive and good, but that can be problematic, right? And you need people around you that note that, then you can synthesize those ideas and then start communicating to people, hey, I know this about my way and the way I communicate. I know that it can be problematic when it comes out this way. Here's how you can hold me accountable to that. Here's how you can support me with that, right? So that's number one, but I think you have to be intentional and you have to really showcase to people that you want to hear what they have to say, right? So that's number one. The act of recording yourself, watching yourself speak, listening to yourself. I know people hate it, but you should do it. You should, if you have a teammate that you have a one-to-one with, ask them if they mind if you record it so you can watch the way you facilitate that meeting or the way that you have back and forth with them. And sometimes because you're recording it, it makes you act a different way, but that's good because maybe it's training you to have new ideas and new ways of doing it. So especially if you,
podcasting, I learned a ton doing podcasts. Like I just cut you off. I'm going to listen to that and say, I just cut you off. But listening to yourself too, recording audio or visual.
Yeah. And then just when there is a challenging moment, knowing when to condition yourself for that way to ask yourself, how am I going to show up and how did I show up in the past when there was a challenging moment? How did I communicate differently during that time? Did I show poise? Did I show resolve? Did I show the appropriate amount of emotion when necessary, or was I overly emotive in that moment? So giving yourself the time and space to be even more intentional about that in times of challenge. And I'd argue right now, like think about yourself as a leader, think about some key moments. Like I'm thinking about a few that have popped into my head and ask, how did I respond in that moment? How do I want to respond differently in the future? Or what do I want to carry over into the future? So a few ideas there. Josh, do you have more or kind of one?
Those are good. Yeah. Reflection. I think reflect though, it's a few pieces, but your reflection needs to be aligned to some of your own self-realization of what things you're working on. So like, how did that conversation go? Good question. But how did that conversation go? And I know I'm working on active listening. How did that conversation go? And I know I'm working on speaking 20% of the time and the other person's speaking 80. So align your reflection to your goals and not just, hey, that felt good. Feels good is good for you. And it might be for both, but tie it to things that you learned from the first two steps you talked about, John.
And that's like when you go to people that you're asking about your communication, it's going to be more effective rather than just asking them, hey, can you tell me about my communication?
Yeah.
If you have the self-awareness where you said, hey, I know I have a tendency to do this. Have you seen that? Can you tell me how you see that show up? And hey, would you be willing to help me by doing X, Y, or Z? Is way more impactful than just, hey, talk to me about my communication at large. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. We'll hit a couple quick notes here too. The other piece is self-awareness, great, but have systems as well. So tie the work that you're thinking about with your structure, or excuse me, with your communication to a structure. So you mentioned one earlier, John. If you know that you have a team with 8 people and 4 of them are big talkers, you need to have a facilitator who has a explicitly shared with the group practice of how we're going to get people to talk and how we're going to have a shared set of voices to talk. So could be a good example of a structure. Another one is to get feedback.
Not
Go ahead.
just there's other things too. If you know you have a team that has a hard time with conflict, or when there's a moment of conflict, they kind of move on from it. You need what's called a conflict minor, right?
Yeah,
And so
that's
this
a good
person,
one.
they see the conflict, and that's part of communication. They say, "Hey, nope, we want to hear your idea. What do you think?" Or, "Hey,
Right.
team, I want to note right now that we're having some conflict, and this is good. Let's carry forward from here. Let's keep it going. Let's keep pushing and like lean into this conflict." So just
Yeah.
you can have tools for a variety of things that your team needs. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, as you added that point, and I'll add the third here that we had taken a note on, is like the idea of a meeting assessment. Really, all of this goes around this category. One of the categories here, that's where most of your communication's happening in a very visible way. That's a team meeting. But have at the end of a team meeting 3 to 4 quick items that are the assessment that you give your team. I like just flashing your fingers. So fist to 5. 5's it was great. 1 was, or fist, it was really poor. Anything in between, but have 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 communication related reflections. So did we share the air today? Did we hear conflict and see it through? Did we make sure we made decisions today as opposed to passing those, along without any clarity? Did we talk about the right items today? Lots of things that your team can decide are part of those assessments, but give the assessment, evaluate the assessment, and then come back to it at the next meeting and say, last week we crushed it with this, but we totally failed to get a balance
Right.
of voices. So we're going to make a focus on that today.
Totally.
So a couple of systematic ways of thinking about applying these communication, the self-awareness that comes first, but then translating that into an operationalized tool in your organization, your team. Really important to do both.
Yep. I'll get into the homework here, and it's a little bit of self-reflection. I think Josh does a good job of telling us to journal, write this down. So I'm going to push you on that. Don't just keep it in your head, get it written down. We want you to think about what are some behaviors you notice in the way you communicate. Are you a big talker? Maybe you're afraid to talk altogether. Maybe you have a body language issue that you're aware of, but you haven't taken the time. Name it, then begin to ask yourself, why am I communicating that way? What am I afraid of? What am I trying to prove? Is this a desire to be liked by people versus being willing to make the tough decisions that sometimes can make people upset? Think about what it might be, right? And really get behind that motive, and then begin to think about, well, what are some things that I can strategize around that behavior? Again, Josh and I would argue that one of the best ways to give language to that is by taking one, like an assessment of sorts that begins to help you to give a framing and a name to the way you communicate as well. So that's where we want you to go for next time. Josh, anything before you take us out here?
I think that's a great place for us to leave it. Please consider doing your homework. We can't really hold you accountable to it, but I think for those who've talked to us about the podcast and have really dug into some of these questions, the anecdotal data it's good. It's been helpful. So we encourage you to do that. As always, the other encouragements, typically week over week, download our podcast, share the podcast with others. We've received some really kind, thoughtful feedback from connections, both online and directly with us about the podcast. So it of course, that keeps us going. We want to be bringing value to our community, to our connections, and to those we don't know yet personally. So the affirming feedback, of course, is great. But if you have questions, concerns, ideas that you think we should be talking about, share those along as well. And until next time, this has been the Leadership Limbo podcast, where we make space for the tension and tools for the journey. See you in the in-between.